This was the beginning of one of the greatest adventures in the history of steam locomotion. The most famous working steam locomotive in the world, the Flying Scotsman, was leaving London on its way to Australia. Port authorities on the River Thames had to make special arrangements for handling this cargo, and so did the P&O line. The 4472 isn't exactly a roll-on or container item. The first stage of the journey was complicated, requiring a big floating crane to get the loco from Dockside Railway to the ship. Initiative for the trip came from the organisers of Aussteam 88, a Melbourne-based group of steam enthusiasts who wanted the Flying Scotsman for their bicentennial steam festival. In 1988, Australians staged thousands of events to celebrate the 200th anniversary of white settlement. However, as a community effort, few could equal the energy and imagination behind the concept of taking the Flying Scotsman right around the world. The container ship NZ Pacific berthed at White Bay in Sydney, where a floating crane unloaded the loco onto a barge for crossing the harbour to a track at Pyrmont. Sydney was the only port with a crane big enough for the job. Melbourne steam fans had the frustration of seeing the loco at Dockside in Melbourne, then watching it sail away to Sydney. Melbourne had recently sold its big floating crane. The engine was fitted out at State Rail workshops, then made a secret test run to Wollongong, a steel and coal city south of Sydney. Although problems with coal caused some delay in Sydney, the run showed that the Flying Scotsman was ready for its Australian adventure. The next day at dawn, the trip to Melbourne began. Melbourne's preparations for the Great Australian Steam Train Festival had been underway for 2 years. Many of the finest steam engines still operating got a special paint and polish for the occasion. Among them, the powerful Hudson-class R761, restored by the Steam Rail Victoria Preservation Group. And at Spotswood Depot in Melbourne, R707 also got its festival colours. Locos from many parts of Australia headed to Melbourne for the Aussteam Festival. From Canberra, Australia's federal capital, came 1210 and 3112. They double-headed south in glorious spring weather, making a brave sight as they rolled through the southern New South Wales and Victorian countryside. The two engines used the standard gauge 4-foot 8.5-inch track that now forms the National Rail network. The lead engine, 1210, was built in 1878. Newly restored, it was on its first full-load trip. 3112 came into service on the New South Wales Railways in 1914. It's privately owned and was leased to the Australian Capital Territory branch of the Australian Railway Historical Society to help 1210 make the trip to Melbourne. On the same day, R761 rolled out of Melbourne with steam fans to meet the northern guests. R761 was running on one of the broad gauge lines that makes up the Victorian state network, 5 foot 3 inches. The different gauges in many parts of Australia are a legacy of state rivalries in pre-Federation days last century. At Alamata Loop, the Canberra and Melbourne trains met. There was time for greetings and some steam talk between Victorian and Northern crews. But timetables had to be kept, and soon they were off again. .12.10 and 31.12 put on the pressure for the next stage, to Seymour. And R761 headed further north to Albury on the New South Wales-Victoria border. Then came the star of the show, the Flying Scotsman. With a light load, it raced through New South Wales, stopping overnight at the southern railway town of Junee. Then, early next day, it crossed the border into Victoria and showed its style as it roared down the standard gauge track to Melbourne. The name Flying Scotsman was bestowed on trains running between London and Edinburgh way back in 1862. However, it's locomotive number 4472 that's become the legendary embodiment of the power and grandeur of the service, and the era when steam was king. 4472 was one of the first 462 Gresley Pacifics of the London and North East Railway. It rolled out of the Doncaster sheds to begin work in February 1923. It steamed more than 2 million miles before going into an active retirement in 1963. The engine has 3 cylinders, 2 of them in the usual positions and a third under the smoke box, where it's hidden from the ordinary onlooker. This gives the engine a distinctive 6 exhaust beats during every revolution of the driving wheels. The main advantage of the 3 cylinders is a reduction of hammer blow on the track and a reduction of vibration in the locomotive. The Scott has driving wheels 6 foot 8 inches in diameter. It weighs more than 96 tonnes and has a boiler pressure of 220 pounds per square inch. The design and workmanship in 4472 led to the loco being displayed at the British Empire exhibition in 1924-25. But it was in 1928 that it became firmly identified with the famed express train of the same name. That year, it created a world record by inaugurating a non-stop service over 329 miles between King's Cross in London and Edinburgh in Scotland. There was a servicing stop at Seymour, a town with a long history as a railway centre. Then it was off on the final leg of the journey into Melbourne. It was a quiet arrival in Melbourne for the famous visitor. The official and more elaborate welcome would come later. For the next 2 months, the Flying Scotsman belonged to Victoria. At the border town of Wodonga, the Victorian steam enthusiasts gave a big welcome to 3801, the official bicentennial train from New South Wales. It was to be escorted to Melbourne by R761 in a thrilling parallel run. Two giants of broad gauge and standard gauge steaming together. It's a unique section of railway. Two gauges side by side for 300 miles. The Pacific Class 3801 is the Australian equivalent of the Flying Scotsman. It's a legend in the history of Australian railways. 3801 went into service with the New South Wales Railways in 1943.
Quay ra là bên đâu ạ?
R761 belongs to a class designed by the Victorian Railways as a post-war express passenger locomotive. 70 of the class were built by the North British Locomotive Company of Glasgow, the first being delivered in 1951. Victorians have a special affection for the R class. Like the 38 class in New South Wales, the R was the right engine at the wrong time, about 20 years too late. The post-war diesel invasion was already well underway. 3801 has been seen by more people in more states than any other Australian locomotive. It was the main contribution to the bicentenary by the New South Wales Railways. One trip took it right across the continent, from Sydney to Perth and back. It had been many years since Seymour had seen so much steam action. Indeed, October 1988 was probably the busiest month for steam on these lines for a quarter of a century. The 38 class engines represented the last significant project in Australian steam locomotive construction. The boiler pressure, the highest in Australia, was 245 pounds per square inch. There's nothing official, of course, but some old drivers claim they've had 3801 roaring along at more than 100 miles an hour. However, on this occasion, the run into Spencer Street Station in Melbourne was a very sedate affair, rather like a royal arrival. Spencer Street Station was also the focal point for most of the activities of Aussteam 88. Huge crowds turned out on the main open day to see working locos that spanned more than a century. Among them, R707, splendidly restored by a volunteer group of Victorian railwaymen. The biggest steam festival ever staged in Australia was a joint effort by representatives of the Association of Railway Enthusiasts, Steam Rail Victoria and the Victorian Division of the Australian Railway Historical Society. Federal and state authorities also assisted the Aussteam venture to ensure its success. D3639, restored by Steam Rail Ballarat, was another locomotive looking its best for the occasion. The 2 weeks of displays and trips on many of Victoria's main and branch lines attracted visitors from all over the world. Tickets for the trip with the Flying Scotsman and the parallel runs were at a premium.
All aboard, please. Train number 2 leaving in 3 minutes.
A steam extravaganza, a triple parallel run involving 4 magnificent steam engines running on 2 gauges. 3801 steams out of the city with D3639 and K153 double heading, all on their way to meet up with R761 for the run down the 3 parallel tracks. At Somerton Loop, R761 teamed up with the trains from Spencer Street. Every seat was taken and thousands of steam enthusiasts were positioned along the track.
Right, we'll give you 10 minutes to get your photos and then right off all the tracks so the engines can leave simultaneously, thank you. 2 minutes for photos, then right off all the tracks, thank you.
The D3639 from the city of Ballarat is of a class that had its origins back in 1902. The class began what was to become a distinctive Victorian style of loco. D3639 continued working until 1974 and returned to service with steam rail in 1984. At times, when all the engines were running abreast and sounding their whistles, the chorus of steam and steel was almost loud enough to drown out the noise of the ABC's helicopter. It had been a day of really spectacular parallel steaming, but at Seymour Yards, R761 staged a little spectacular all of its own. It ran off the tracks. The incident was captured on home video by a steam enthusiast. The accident caused only very minor damage to the loco, and railwaymen at Seymour did well to get the engine back on the tracks in little more than 3 hours. R761 was able to make its scheduled run out of Melbourne the next day. At Sunshine, just north of Melbourne, the Flying Scotsman took on passengers for its first passenger run in Australia. There had been a stampede for seats on all excursions by 4472, and the demand was such that additional runs had to be planned. On this Sunday, the Flying Scotsman had perfect weather for a day in the Australian bush. Passengers and enthusiasts travelling in cars beside the track were treated to a top display of steam power and a generous turn of speed. When the festival was over, 1210 and 3112 headed back to New South Wales. Both are Bayer Peacock locos from Manchester. Running with them for part of the journey was K153 from Steamrail. .3112 is one of 145 of the class built for the New South Wales Railways from 1903 onwards. It ran for 58 years on Sydney suburban tracks before being retired. In 1986, it was bought by Sydney engineer Barry Tulloch and completely overhauled. Loco 1210 made a mark in history by hauling the first train into Australia's national capital, Canberra, in 1914. At 110 years old, it's the oldest operating steam locomotive in Australia. The K-Class 280 locomotives started coming off the production line at Newport in Melbourne in 1922. Another batch was produced in the 1940s. K153 was returned to service by Steamrail Victoria in 1974. and apart from an overhaul in 1983, has been in continuous service ever since. Throughout all the Steam Festival trips, special care was taken in servicing all the locomotives. Because of its age, 1210 got very special attention. Even so, the long journey home wasn't without incident. A boiler problem led to minor damage in the firebox, which put the loco out of action for a short time. After the servicing stop, K153 and the two Northern Specials parted company. At Spencer Street Station, the Flying Scotsman stands ready for another of the big events on its Victorian itinerary, a parallel run with R761. Nearly 1,000 steam fans packed the two trains.
Yeah, all clear.
The owner of 4472, the Honourable William McAlpine, gave his engine away from the guest car behind R761. He'd made a special trip to Australia to see the Flying Scotsman going through its paces down under. for Bill McAlpine, it was a champagne occasion. His loco was performing magnificently and being cared for and handled with great affection. The run into Seymour and the end of a tremendous steam experience, and the promise of more of the same on the return journey. The Flying Scotsman's Australian adventure was off to a great start.